Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 152 of ASBN Live, Effectively Engaging Media. I'm your host, Tulasi Sivalingam, the American Sustainable Business Network's Director of Events and Programming. This webinar is co-presented by the American Sustainable Business Network, the Ohio Sustainable Business Council, and the Ohio University Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Service. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Katie Ellman of ASBN to tell us a little bit more about what we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you so much, Tulasi. It's an honor to be here representing the American Sustainable Business Network as their communications lead. In addition to my work with ASBN, I'm also a media producer and leader of a community-based organization in Queens, New York. So I am very familiar with engaging in the media in each of these roles. I do a substantial amount of media relations and creating messaging, pitching stories, fielding pitches, and also acting as a spokesperson. So I'm thrilled to be able to be here with Daniel to, share the knowledge that we have around effectively engaging the media. I'm especially interested in amplifying the stories and profiles of individuals and organizations and businesses that are working to make our communities more equitable and resilient. And I think an important piece of that work is being able to help make the business case for clean energy and sustainable manufacturing projects in communities across the country and in Ohio. So again, I'm very happy to be here to share the knowledge that I have with you and to be joined by Daniel, who's a leader in this space locally. So I would like to pass things over to Daniel now so he can tell you a little bit more about himself.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm Daniel Van Hoogstraten. I'm with a firm called Amplifire. It's a strategic communications firm based in Columbus, Ohio. Thank you all for joining today. Just, excuse me, just want to tell you a little bit about myself. And why we're here and what's brought us together. So just by way of my background, I was previously was the state director for a statewide issue advocacy and political organization in Ohio. Before that, I served on Capitol Hill as the communications director for a couple of members of Congress, including the former chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I've worked on political campaigns across the country, including Texas, West Virginia, and Ohio. And at Amplifire, our firm now, I use my communications background and experience in government and on campaigns to support corporate and nonprofit clients. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about what's brought us together here today and why it's important to support leaders from different sectors, from organized labor to energy to sustainable manufacturing. So I'm here because I'm working with Ohio University's Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Service and others on the press and communications side of an exciting project that many of you all, I'm sure, are aware of, and that's the Ohio Valley Green Energy Manufacturing Initiative, known as Ohio Valley GEM, and the reindustrialization of the former Portsmouth diffusion plant near Piketon, Ohio. The project embraces hydrogen technologies, which are moving Ohio and our country toward a more sustainable energy and manufacturing economy. So we're also joined by Katie, who you just heard from with the American Sustainable Business Network. And so before I get started with my training portion and Katie's section, just a bit more context. So throughout the Ohio Valley and surrounding areas, communities have been left behind as energy production and manufacturing have shifted over the last several decades. The Ohio Valley GEM, the project I just described a bit about, represents a unique opportunity to reinvigorate these areas by creating union jobs through a new era of clean power generation and manufacturing. The foundational project of the Ohio Valley GEM will be the reindustrialization of the former ports facility near Piketon. It's a bipartisan, labor-focused, functioning public-private partnership that's the result of a 12-year effort to establish a transformational economic development strategy coordinated under the leadership of OU's Voinovich School and the Southern Ohio Diversification Initiative. And through that process, we are keeping the media up to date with the progress and milestones in order to drive the narrative that can continue the momentum. So that's what's brought us here together today. And I'll hand it back over to Katie here in a moment. And we have slides to share, so you don't have to stare at my mug all afternoon. But thank you for being here, and look forward to chiming back in after Katie's portion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Daniel. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so here we are. Today's agenda simply is to use the talking points and the goal of this session, as Daniel just outlined, to share tips and ideas and recommendations on how labor leaders and business leaders, especially in renewables and regardless of your industry, really, you can use these points and tips to effectively engage with the media and get messaging out. And since a lot of these issues are polarizing and politicized, there has to be a way we can use these tools as a way to level the playing field and to offer a counterpoint to a lot of narrative that is in the media in regards to backlash against some of these projects, by framing things in a positive way to allow for better attention and opportunity and, as we like to say, conversions to the cause that you are trying to get out there. After my brief section at the top, I will turn things back over to Daniel for the bulk of the media training, and then we'll come back together at the end to do a brief how-to on how to effectively write a pitch, which is your outreach tool to media outlets. And then at the end, we'll come back together to answer any questions that you may have. So, as you know, I'm from the American Sustainable Business Network, ASBN, and the organization in its former iteration has been around for over 30 years. The mission of the organization is to inform, connect, and mobilize business leaders and investors across sectors toward a just and sustainable economy. The overall vision of ASBN is a sustainable economy that's stakeholder-driven, regenerative, just, and prosperous. So in the role in regards to communications and media engagement, ASBN works through our policy team to advocate for projects that will advance these agendas in Washington, and works with our local affiliates in states to advance the same agendas there. We would love for all of you to join us at our annual conference this fall in Berkeley, California. For more information, you can contact Felicity. Her contact information is here, and you can also visit our website. There are sponsorship and early bird discounts. So if you would like to look into sponsorship, please reach out. And also, if you register early, you get a discount. But we'd love to see you there. So let's get into the meat of this. What is media engagement? It's important to talk about what this means. Most people have social media accounts, and that's usually how they reach their followers and audience. But there's a specific way for businesses and labor leaders to engage with media to present themselves as experts in their fields, which they are, and to lift up the conversation of a just and sustainable economy is crucial, and how it works to create solutions toward good jobs, strong, responsible businesses, and an economy that works for all. And in more detail and simply, media engagement is incredibly important for every type of organization and business. It helps you build, your brand awareness, as it says. You are the expert, and in the day-to-day of your roles and your respective jobs and fields, it's hard to remember that, but you are a source for information for media outlets and journalists. And so we want to capitalize on that. Also, the more engagement you have in the media and print, Daniel will go into it, radio or web, the more you'll attract allies and partners to your cause, or you could generate business leads. But a really interesting point of this, as I mentioned briefly before, especially depending upon the climate in which you're operating, you are again countering usually what is, a well-funded counter narrative or campaign to the work that you're doing. Excuse me. So the types of media engagement, I just mentioned them briefly, is television, radio, print, and online. So these are like the 4 buckets that Daniel will be focusing on. But these are all ways that we as individuals engage with media currently, and these are also the outlets that we can use to amplify our messaging. So I will stop there. I will pass things over to Daniel, and then I will see you again for pitching 101 at the end.
Thank you, Katie. Now let me see if I can share my screen. Just kidding. Sure I can. The age-old challenge. All right. Second. Katie, you want to give me a thumbs up if that looks all right? Okay. Thank you. Hey, everyone, again, for anyone who joined after I gave my intro, I'm Daniel Van Hoogstraten with Amplifire Strategic Communications, a firm based in Columbus that's working closely with OU and others on the reindustrialization project in the ports facility. So thanks for being with us here today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about media and how to engage media. So I'll get started. First, before I do, and most importantly, I just want to thank our sponsors and partners in this project: OU's Voinovich School, ASBN, the Ohio Sustainable Business Council, SODI, Tri-State Building Trades. In particular, obviously, this project is a partnership between labor and the private sector, and that's incredibly important and something that we've stressed in the media. The Pike County Chamber of Commerce and the Ohio Valley Regional Development Commission. So thank you to those organizations. All right, media landscape in Ohio. And before I get into this real quick, I just want to say that through my presentation, I'm sure I'll be saying some things that people here know. I'm hopeful that it'll be interesting and informational to all of you on some level. But media landscape, the reason I was reminded of that is because I think everyone's aware that we've had a reduction, consolidation, and realignment of media in the state of Ohio, but I want to talk just a little bit about that. So first things first, well, you have 12 media markets, which makes it a complex and interesting state, just like it is outside of media. I mean, there's different regions, different geographies, different cultures throughout the state. And the media market landscape, in terms of how it's broken up, is sort of reflective of that, which I find to be interesting. We have had a reduction in newspapers, obviously. Fewer local papers, less newsroom staff. We've seen here in Ohio, frankly, what's happening across the country. There's projections that a third of American newspapers that existed 2 decades ago will be out of business by 2025. And over 25% have died in the last 15 years. Now, that is obviously negative, in my opinion, at least. But there's some other positives to be aware of as we kind of think about media holistically, which I'll get into in a moment. Consolidation. Ohio actually probably is the state that's seen the largest regional consolidation of any state in the country. Since 2014, more than 30% of the state's papers have changed ownership. And 5 of the largest changed: Gatehouse, Gannett, AIM, Ogden, another one, own, I think, 120 papers in Ohio. It's to say that, there's been a major consolidation. For example, in 2016, AIM purchased close to 40 papers and including 16 small dailies in the western and central part of the state. Gannett controls over 20 dailies, plus over 30 weeklies, like the Akron Beacon Journal and the Dispatch and the Inquirer. So the consolidation piece is an important thing to know about as well, at least. Now, while we've seen all this, there's also been a realignment. And what I mean by that is a number of new online outlets, a growing number of kind of nonprofit newsrooms that primarily produce online content, as well as online media companies. And they shouldn't be underestimated, given the overall media climate. For example, Ohio Capital Journal, Signal Cleveland is new, Axios Columbus and Axios Cleveland, Mahoning Matters is another. So This slide was just to sort of give an overview of the media landscape in Ohio and understand that it's sort of reducing, consolidating, but also realigning in ways that can be taken advantage of. All right, meet the press. What you need to know when working with the media. I'm going to go into this now. First is cultivating relationships with the press. Be cooperative. You know, reporters face pressures and deadlines in the newsroom like all of us do in our jobs or in our leadership positions. And cooperation can go a long way to convey your messages and have a positive outcome. Again, that's obvious, but I do think it's something to lead with and something to live by when working with the press. And being accessible goes hand in hand with that. If a reporter has called you, it means they're writing a story. And being accessible to them is one way to ensure that your message stands out and makes it into that story. So prioritizing accessibility can pay dividends for your message in the media. Be direct. If you can't provide information or speak to a reporter at that time, let them know why. I think that just goes back to creating the relationship. Next is be a resource. I mean, I think most people on this call are leaders within their industry or within their organization, and that goes into the authority piece too. But you are a resource. You are an authority. Showing an effort to provide that information to a reporter and build trust can be beneficial. Take the media calls as a compliment, as an authority. You are seen as an authority in your field if they're contacting you or if you're successful in pitching them. And so I think the main key takeaway of this is maintain the relationship, build the relationship, be honest, be direct, be a resource. And every media interview is an opportunity to reinforce expertise, authority, and leadership and your organization's message. All right. I'm going to go through an interview checklist. I also have some notes that I'm having my emails at the end of this presentation. So if anyone wants my notes, I'm happy to send them to them. Just shoot me an email after this. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which I'm not sure if we have, is if you have any questions throughout this, type them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end. Okay. Interview checklist. Gather details on the nature of the story. If you've been reached out to for a story, try to gather details on what they're asking for. And that could be a question back to the reporter doing a little bit of research on your end. Or if you've pitched a story to the media or someone in your organization has, make sure that you're well-versed. Identify likely participants. Again, obvious, but it's important to know who's going to be in this interview. On your end and on theirs. Let's say you're the executive director of an organization and you've got a communications staffer and maybe a policy expert, and you want all three of them there so that the policy expert can chime in on background, for example. Identifying your own participants and then theirs. Is their editor going to be on, just so that you're prepared going in. Prepare key messages. What are your messages going in? What do you want the headline to be? And how are you going to form that? And I'll get to that in a moment. Track down facts and figures. Those can help drive a story and they can be used in your message or asked about in the questions so that you are ready to reply with facts and figures that'll resonate with the reporter. Gather information about the reporter and their previous work. Sounds obvious, but can go a long way and it's pretty easy. Look at the stories that they've written recently, especially ones that are relevant to what they might be writing about that you've been asked to talk on or that you've pitched them on, to get a sense of their tone and their approach. Anticipate questions, sort of try to determine the likely line of inquiry. Something that I always do when I speak to the media or have someone speak to the media is go over what we think the questions will be. Straightforward, but takes the time, is worth the time. And that goes into the next one. Take time and prepare and practice. It's pretty straightforward. Anticipate the questions, know your answers, know your key messages, try to drive them home. At the end of the day, a story, you could talk to a reporter for 30 minutes and there might only be a 2-sentence quote in the story, as I'm sure many of you on this webinar have experienced, and that's fine. But knowing how to drive what those 2 sentences are and the context they're within can be done by determining your messages ahead of time and really driving them home. And I'll get into that in a little bit and sort of techniques that can be used to do that. All right, what to expect from different media, TV, print / online. I'm combining them, which is sort of a sin, but whatever. For this purpose, I think it's fine. And radio. I'll actually start with print/online. And we think about a print reporter, a newspaper reporter, and some of these newer online outlets. They tend to be the best prepared. They may have covered a specific beat for several years and have expertise and institutional knowledge that many others in the media do not. They tend to have moving targets with deadlines and maybe working on longer deadlines. That's obviously not always true. Many occasions where a print reporter will say, hey, I need to quit in the next hour. But they sometimes have longer deadlines. They will use fact sheets, reports, background documents in their reporting, and it's always good to sort of gather background information to be able to send a reporter, even if they are an expert in the field like you are. Giving them the information that you want them to have can be beneficial for obvious reasons. I mentioned this before, but the interview time will often far exceed the space you receive in the paper. And I think it's important to know that and to prepare for that, because you think of an interview with a print reporter, if you're given the time, as a way to provide them context and background with your message, right? Here's what they need to know. Here are the facts, here are the figures. You can send those to you. But it's also important to think about, what are my messages? What are the 3 things I really want in here? And repeat and repeat and repeat. I'm sure you've heard about message discipline 1,000 times before. And in my opinion, that's what it is what are the messages that you want to be disciplined on, and how often can you repeat them in the broader context of what you're providing a reporter. The other thing to be aware of is that oftentimes print reporters are really well trained, and many reporters are, but I've found that print reporters are really well trained in interview techniques to get people to talk, and they'll have a very specific interview style. And what that's meant for me is they are silent. They'll ask you a question, you'll give your answer that's really short, potentially, and they'll just sort of sit there and wait. And it's human nature to want to fill the void by talking. But it's important to be aware that that's a technique, and you don't need to fill the void. If they've asked you your question, you've answered their question. They can fill that void. It's not up to you. All right. Talk a little bit about television. First and foremost, cameras miss nothing. They're very likely always on. If you're about to do a TV interview and you're sitting in a studio, or if you're on Zoom now, a lot of TV reporters like to do that. Or if you're at a press conference and there's cameras there, just assume that you're being filmed. Again, not that any of us have anything to hide, but obviously there are messages that you are prepared to deliver and messages that you're not. So just always assume the camera's on. The other thing to remember is television reporters will often very likely have very little background information and are really just mainly looking for what they need to air their story. So thinking about that key message, it's less of a long form background conversation and more of a get your message out there, get quoted, because reporters are working on TV reporters, very tight deadlines, often more than one story at a time, especially now that newsrooms have shrunk a bit. So to that point, interviews are often quick and to the point. Last kind of tidbit that I'd like to share is that when you're on TV, every gesture is exaggerated. I like to talk about this because I gesture a lot, and when I go on TV, when I've been on TV, I see it, I'm like, oh my God. So try to stay still and look at your interviewer, not directly at the camera. All right, radio. So radio is often looking for color to add to their piece. And so think about creating a visual in a listener's mind. It's not about just the facts and the figures. Can you verbally allow a listener to visualize something? A radio reporter will jump on that and probably use that clip. Speaking clearly and distinctly in your normal tone can help create really good clips as well. And like any reporter, but like as I mentioned before, the print reporter, they really do appreciate fact sheets and background information that you can send them offline as well. So that is what to expect from a 1,000-foot view from different types of media. and I'll move on. Developing and delivering a strong message, and knowing what to say and how to say it. These headlines here on the left are just some examples of things that as we've worked through this project with some companies and partners, that we've been able to get thanks to the hard work of those companies and partners. But it's also to remind us that going into any interview or into any media outreach is thinking about what's the headline you want, what's your main message. And I think in some cases we've achieved that with this project. In some cases we haven't, but it's something we always need to keep the eye on the ball with. And luckily, because it's such an interesting project with so many dynamic partners and people involved, it is something the media is interested in, but we got to tell them about it or else we're not going to know. So, tips for successful media interviews. So you've got your press person or someone like me who says, hey, CEO X, such and such reporter wants to talk to you. Here's how they will hopefully be preparing you. State your conclusions first and then again at the close. As I said, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them you told them. So it's like, just assume that you need to drive that message home. Next is keep your responses benefit driven. This is, I think, maybe the most important one, if you can weave it in properly. So I just think the basis is people don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. It's sort of corny, but keep messages focused on issues and how they impact people and keep the language relatable. So just kind of looking back at our ports reindustrialization project, when we talk about it, why does it matter to people, right? Like all the hydrogen and this, that, and the other is super interesting, and the reporters are interested, but it's also, it's jobs. It's reinvigorating local economies. It's relying on union labor for good paying jobs. That is a picture that you can paint for this project. And it applies to any conversation with media, is what's the human story and how can you weave that in? All right, next is no comments. People disagree with me on this, but I think the phrase has become sort of a benchmark for dishonesty, and good communicators know how to avoid it. There are exceptions to that rule, certainly, but I'll get into later of how to answer a question that you don't want to answer in a way that's not a no comment. I'll get to that sort of towards the end of my presentation. So I'll move on from that for now. You don't know, say so. You can't be expected to know everything, even if you are the CEO, COO of a company, the head of a labor union, whomever, a policy expert, communications expert. You don't need to know everything, nor can you be expected to respond to information on the fly, which is what an interview is. So if you know an answer, great. If you don't, or you need more time to think about it or get back to them, just say so. And I think having that in the back of your mind can help create a more comfortable environment for an interview, because if you just don't want to answer something, or if you don't know the answer, the default is not to try to wing it. It's, hey, let me get back to you on that. Next, and I'm not even going to elaborate on this, but always tell the truth. It's not worth, the alternative is not worthwhile. Stick to your game plan. So some reporters will ask you the same question more than once to get a new answer. You cannot obviously control the questions they ask, but you can control your answers. So it's just standing your ground and following your plan. What are your messages? How are you driving them home? What's the background information you're comfortable giving? Being prepared for that, and you're able to stick to your game plan, in my experience. Okay. Message creation. So, I think this is probably most relevant to communications consultants, communications people who are working for an organization, but also the heads of organizations when they're thinking about how are they going to develop that message that they're using to prepare themselves for a media interview, a public speaking engagement, the message of their organization, company, nonprofit, whatever. Okay. So first, cover the basics: who, what, when, where, why. Obvious, but something that not everyone can always answer, but you should be able to without hesitation. Keep it short. Obviously, you may need to elaborate on any number of things, but try to keep sort of an elevator pitch on what your message is pretty short, maybe 30 seconds. Whether it's radio, TV, or print, the media will often only use a few seconds or a sentence or so of what you're giving them. So what's that core message? And what are the three key messages? So it's like the core and the three key. Keep it interesting. I mean, to state the obvious, but find ways to make your issues interesting to reporters and the general audience. Again, especially with this project, you know, sometimes I hear experts talk about it and I'm blown away by how smart they are, because they're talking about energy and manufacturing. And again, that is interesting, but you need to find ways to connect it to the overall message, the project, and the human element of all of it. Which I've seen a lot of leaders involved in this project do really successful. And I think that's part of why the media, especially in Southern Ohio, has taken interest in this so much. I mean, it's been going on for a long time too. And the media, you know, I'd say, hey, have you heard of it? And they're like, yeah, we know what you're talking about. So that's part of it too. Protect your best interests. Your message is what you want to say. You know, you and your organization's best interest. You do not have to answer a reporter's question when speaking publicly to a group of people. What's in your best interest? What matters to your organization? Obviously, there are partnerships. There's this, that, and the other. You always want to be honest, forthright, forthcoming, but your best interest is the priority. Keep your eye on the bottom line. And this is just sort of a reiteration. It's like, what's the goal? What's the resolution? What's the call to action? The core message. And then the last one I have up here is soundbite. It's basically like, don't be boring. You know, what makes you, your message, your issue unique, new, fascinating? That's what's going to make it in. All right. And this is my last slide. And it has to do with handling tough questions. And I said earlier about the no comment stuff. So there's several techniques, once your message has been created, that can help you effectively communicate that message and ensure you drive the conversation in the direction that you want it to be driven in. And these techniques can also help you respond to tough questions that are not on kind of the point, that are not on point with the message you want to share, maybe something you don't even want to answer. So I'll go through those really quickly too. The first is what's called bridging. And I'm just going to give some examples of how to use the bridging technique to respond to a question you don't want to answer and flip it to something you do. And I'm just going to, that's an interesting question, and I can share with you blank. So way to, you know, sort of answer their question, not be rude, but answer whatever the heck you want to answer. Let me address your question by sharing with you blank. And that's a way to switch it on them a bit too. If you really want to if you feel like they've put you on the spot and you don't want to answer it, you can say, rather than no comment. And what I think is a good alternative is, I can't speak to that, but what I can tell you is blank. And again, if you're prepared with your core messages and your background, that's something that can easily be done. Question turnaround. And that's when you've been asked a question kind of similarly that you don't quite want to answer, but you kind of want to like turn it around. And here are some examples of that. Let me address that question by first explaining the facts. Then you can kind of get into your core facts. That's not accurate. Here's what I know to be true. And that's if some reporter asks you, hey, I heard from such and such source this. Well, if it's not true, tell them, but then flip it. Question turnaround. And then one, what we should all be asking ourselves is blank. And there are other examples of question turnaround, but having these in your back pocket is a way, at least in my experience and the experience of people at principals I've worked with, to be really comfortable going into interviews, because at the end of the day, if you're comfortable going into an interview and you can be conversational and relatable, it really provides for a better interview. And I've seen really advanced people who are really good at it and really bad at it. And I think what sets them apart is how confident they are to be on message, and how confident they are to be able to answer questions that they don't want to answer with answers that they want to give. And these are techniques to do that. And lastly is flagging for emphasis. And that is not so much a handling tough questions technique, but it's a driving your core message home. So if you have these in your mind, it reminds you to do that. And they are, let me be clear, though. What people need to know is blank. If we take anything away from this, blank. What matters most is, and I'd like to reiterate. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So thank you all. I think, as I said at the beginning of this, that this is a 1,000-foot view. Happy to dive deeper with anyone, send people notes. But when I was sort of going through the process of putting this together, I was thinking, okay, we're going to have leaders on this call who probably have spoken to the media, some of them, I'm sure, many, many times, but would maybe benefit from my perspective and some techniques. Again, I could go on for hours and probably get to a level that would be more useful to some of you and less useful to others. But I hope that through this process, I was at least somewhat useful to everyone. So thanks so much. And I will hand it back to Katie. And again, here's my cell phone number. Text me, call me, but preferably email me at this email if you want anything from me. Thanks so much. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was awesome. And I can relate to much of what you said in my experience interacting with the media as an expert. So I will continue my portion of the presentation with a little lesson on pitching.
Yeah, well, that's all working out just fine. So yeah.
So pitching 101, and this is really basic, depending upon where you are on your journey here. A general question is, what is a pitch? I'll start by saying what a pitch is not, and a pitch is not a press release or a press advisory. Those contain a lot more information or data, and you send that out before an event, or you send it out to recap something that has happened already, an event or a launch or a release or a statement about some big news that's happening in your industry or in your organization. So a media pitch is brief. I can't stress that enough. We all have a lot to say, and we feel a sense of urgency in including as much information as possible to share why what we want covered is important and should be highlighted in the forms of media that Daniel went into. But we want to keep this succinct, clear, and to the point, as brief as possible. It should be, a max for paragraphs with about 200 to 300 words. Obviously, there's some latitude there, but you want to send this as an email or a direct message, which also is a reason why you want it to be brief, because people are reading this typically, if not on their desktop, on a mobile device. And we want to make sure that it's not going to just be ignored. I would say if you want to send additional information, you would just want to include those items as links to what it is you're outlining in the pitch. So let's get into what the contents of a pitch or the general structure is. It's pretty self-explanatory. The introduction is, the who, what, where, why of what you're doing, providing general information about what you're talking about. The meat of it is the story. This is where you can be as passionate as you want about sharing the background about what it is you want the media to cover. I just want to take a moment to touch on tone. So you want to be courteous in your interaction. You don't have to be super formal, but you want to make sure that the language is courteous. And you also want to make sure that you don't have typos in your work. It is not the end of the world and everyone's busy, but you want to make sure that it looks like you took the time and effort in putting making sure that you proofread what you sent to the media outlet. In regards to references and links, as I just mentioned, you want to include those with the pitch. And when at all possible, do not send attachments, just send them as the direct links or use them as hyperlinks under text in your messaging. And then lastly, the call to action, the CTA, what is it? What is it exactly that you're looking for? And include your information clearly and as many contact options as possible for the journalist or the reporter to be able to get in touch with you. Generally, it's not always possible, especially with smaller companies, but a lot of larger organizations have a designated media person that would be funneling and doing the setting up of interviews. But doing it yourself is actually sometimes better because it cuts down on someone in the middle having to adjust schedules and make sure that the subject is available at the given time. And something that happens frequently is that you don't have very much notice for when you are going to be interviewed. So you could send out a pitch and not hear anything, and then at 4 p.m. on a Thursday get a text or a call or an urgent email or DM, and the person's like, can I speak to you in 15 minutes? So you just want to make sure whatever you're presenting in your pitch, you have that down pat so you can be ready, along with Daniel's recommendations, to speak with that particular media representative. We're going to get to this in a few moments when I share some sample pitches, but brief tips in writing your pitch is, one, as Daniel mentioned, knowing your audience. So knowing which reporters and media outlets cover your beat of what it is you're an expert in, renewables, labor, sustainability, whatever it is, there are set reporters that focus on those things at especially the larger national outlets. And then there are subsets in the local markets, typically, that would cover that. So you want to make sure that your subject line is something that the reader can relate to, and that they don't read it and think, why am I getting this? This is nothing that I cover, unless you're trying to do a human interest story, but we're not focusing on that now. So let's make sure the subject line is interesting and brief, and that's the hook. That's how you're going to get someone to open your message and hopefully respond and read it. The first sentence is a continuation of that. And then, as I said, avoid typos, make sure you proofread your pitch. And when you close your email, you just want to make sure, again, that you're courteous and that you're including all of the necessary contact information. But just in regards to when you're pitching, you just want to make sure that your pitch includes an angle that is relevant to the interests of the publication and or the reporter that you're pitching to. And a few questions to ask yourself, is the news fresh and relevant to current events? Is it going to the way you're writing the pitch, and do you think it will arouse interest and emotions in the reader and the audience? And since many people are working with labor and trying to better the lives of our communities and trying to do community solar or environmental projects, those things do elicit a lot of emotion on both sides. So I just want to keep that in mind. Lastly, you send the pitch and you're like, okay, why isn't anybody contacting me? My story's great. Everyone needs to know about this. When following up, one touch point, one email or message is enough. You want to be a source for the expertise that you're presenting to the media outlets that you're pitching to. So you want to come across as being an expert, being courteous, and also not being annoying, to put it bluntly. You want to be the person they come to, and you don't want them to go to potentially someone else that would present things in a negative light and counter to what you're presenting. So the rule of thumb applies the same. Keep your follow-up short and simple, and wait 3 days to a week to follow up about your pitch. So here is a sample pitch. One of my other roles is producing a podcast on sustainable business, and I receive pitches frequently for potential guests to share information about the great things they're doing, just like all of you here. So this was an interesting pitch that I received that I thought would be a good example. And I'll just point out here at the top. So the subject line appealed to me immediately. Simply climate math, how you can read it yourself. Sorry, I won't bore you. But this person did their homework. And that's the other thing, that Daniel said, and I'll reiterate, you have to do your homework and make it easy for the reporter who has limited time and is doing multiple stories. You want to make it easy for them. So this person did a great salutation. I'm not included in the contact form, but they knew that I was the producer and they included me. So extra points for that. They did a lot of work for me here by giving background information, including the hyperlinks to the reports, other data information, and then they're pitching the CEO of a bank, a finance company, and they're including information about that person here in the third brief paragraph with a link to this person's LinkedIn and bio. The kicker here, which is the best part for the person that has to receive the pitches, is including the talking points outlined in a clear way that's easy to read and that is not overwhelming. So obviously we often feel like everything we have to talk about is important, and it is, but if we can dial in specifically to a handful, 3 to 5 talking points, the other points will come up in conversation and you can weave them into the conversation yourself, but you don't want to be all over the place in this section about, what you're going to talk about. Keep it concise, brief, and focused. So I would say if you can suggest talking points, especially bulleted, the person that is receiving that pitch and that is going to be making decisions, it does go a long way, and it helps do some of the work that the reporter or producer has to do when collecting background information and coming up with interview questions. Another sample, which is from our friend Maida here, the executive director of the Ohio Sustainable Business Council. And, this is also a really important project nationally and locally. But her subject is to the point and outlines exactly what she's trying to express and talk about. Courteous email, very straightforward, and includes the background information as we discussed, hyperlinks under the text. And then on the bottom, she adds other resources that would be helpful for the reporter or media outlet to know about. She offers her help and support, as well as asking, pitching for media coverage of community solar. So those are two relevant and recent examples that can be easily emulated, and I'm happy to share any of these tips and points in a very brief way. I can, through Felicity, we'll make sure that we could share examples and also these tips written out should you need them. So here we come to the end of the formal presentation, but I just wanted to, thank Daniel and thank everyone on the team for allowing ASBN to present in this panel. And, me personally, I think messaging is so important, and media engagement is something that any individual and organization can do with limited resources, time, and money. It's just getting over the hump to get started. So we will open things up to Q&A now. Daniel will begin, and thank you all very much.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, let me, I think some Q&A ended up in the chat and some in the Q&A, but I'll do the first one that came in the Q&A. And the question is, with TV and online media, given they are on a short time, would sending a pitch with a link to a high quality pre-recorded message interview style video clip be an option that would increase the likelihood of picking up the story? It's a great question. In my experience, TV will want to conduct an interview. So giving them like a pre-recorded interview may not make it on, but they will often use or have like B-roll, so to add some color to a story, say, hey, we have this B-roll available. And by B-roll, I mean like an action shot that's relevant to the story. Like if you're a union, like something in the trade shop of like workers working, I've seen that work before. Like, hey, let's get like 30 seconds of B-roll, offer it with a story that could increase the likelihood. I may be alone in the opinion that they may not take like pre-recorded message. That's a good question though. I've not tried it. Katie, anything to add to that? Okay. All right, let me get to another question. Someone said, what was that last technique called? Let me pull open my slides to make sure that I'm addressing the right question. Oh yeah, flagging for emphasis. So, not to restate what I said, but, just hammering home your point. That's what it was called. Here's another question we've got. This is a good one because I do it all the time. Any suggestions on correcting the record with media outlets if they publish or air an angle to a story that you did with them that isn't accurate or aligned with what you intended? So yeah, I think two things. Number one, if it is there, I think there's a nuance here. Isn't accurate and isn't aligned with what you intended are two different things. If there's an inaccuracy in it, I would suggest asking for a correction. Isn't aligned with what you intended, I think there's a lot of strategy around that. And I think what it is following up with the reporter or the producer to try to do a follow-up story. Let's say that they're getting an interview, they took an angle, they interviewed the opposition to a development project, but didn't interview the proponents and only got the CEO of the company. And like, that's just not enough. Kind of back to the question before is like, does packaging up a pre-recorded interview work? I think the concept here is packaging up a story for a reporter that saves them time and energy and effort is successful. And by that, what I mean is if you're going to go back at them with a new angle and say, hey, I know you covered this, but we think that you should come back to this story. We've got, and I think that in one of the pitches that Katie shared, there was a good example of this. I've got X, Y, and Z experts for you to speak to, or this worker and this policy expert, and like frame up a story for them that you're really, so maybe you kind of like tried it first and they didn't use the angle you wanted. Okay, go back to them and frame it in a way that there's very little chance that they could get it wrong, and follow up and say that you don't agree, they didn't cover the full perspective and you think it's worth another story. And I've had success with that. But again, I think that's separate from if they're inaccuracies. If they're inaccuracies, you should ask for a correction and show them what they are. All right, I'm looking to see if there are any others? I don't see any. If anyone's got questions, go ahead, type them in. Got a few minutes here.
Daniel, can you check your DM? There is a question about which medium you find most accurate.
Oh, I'm
Can you
sorry.
touch on that?
Yeah.
That's a very good question, and I think it depends. In regards to the question of correcting the record with media outlets, my experience has been that smaller news publications sometimes include errors, and you can have them corrected. And the same can happen with larger national, international outlets. Like even the New York Times has to issue corrections. So I think most accurate anonymous attendee, I would say, do you see that? Or the print
Here now.
media, I would say, depending, can be incredibly accurate and allows for corrections. Whereas if it is video, much less so. If there's an error in that, there's no time to correct it and go out and shoot another interview unless you're, the governor or something like that. If it's just a local leader, they usually won't do that unless it's such a glaring error. That has been my experience, but Daniel may have a different take on it.
No, I think that's basically my experience too. A couple things I'd add to that. I think that we run into a lot of the times, especially in a project like we're framing this around, the project I discussed, are reporters in newsrooms that are spread really thin. And they may intend to be accurate, but they're just certainly not, they don't have the time to get to the bottom of every little nuance and detail. So I think you can find inaccuracies a lot of the time in reporting that's done by a really small, strained newsroom just because they don't have the resources to necessarily have all of the background information. The point of me saying that is it goes back to what I was talking about, providing background facts, figures. If you can frame the story up for them, if you're announcing a project, announcing a partnership, part of a development, don't just send, here's a 2-sentence quote about it. Okay, here's a quote, and here's what you need to know about it. And their story's a lot more likely to be accurate. But yeah, I think my opinion is that that reporters in general, particularly on the state and local level, are intending to be accurate, and helping them get there can go a long way because they don't want to be inaccurate. I will also say that when you become an expert in an issue and you start reading media reports about that issue, you realize how off base it often is. And that's really frustrating. So it's something I think we just constantly have to deal with, but it's part of the reason for this training too. It's how do you help them be accurate? I think we got it all. Give folks another minute or two to type in questions in the Q&A or the chat. I'm monitoring both right now, so I'll just go back through to make sure I didn't miss anything.
There is a question about, and I think I could be wrong, this is more about getting through on social media, of being able to amplify messaging by sidestepping algorithms. So I'm wondering if that is what Mike is referencing in that question.
I'll take a look. I just saw there's another question here from someone saying, we're exploring purchasing a license to a PR service with an extensive database that provides email access to journalists. What's your opinion of the value of such services? So I've used them. I think they can be incredibly helpful. They are, from my experience, they're good. They do what they say they're going to do. They do update as journalists come and go. Some are better than others. I will not advertise for any of them on this. But What I'll say is, I think for me, the most important, if you are, depending on who you are as an organization or company, if you're someone who is dealing nationally or statewide or with like multiple publications, then yeah, I mean, if you can afford it and you want to spend that money on it and you have a budget line item for it, I do think they're valuable. But I think oftentimes you can do it on your own, or your staff can do it on their own. If it's a small enough universe that you're trying to track down, all of the information that's available in those databases is findable online, or at least the vast majority of it. But it can be an enormous research project. And a lot of those services allow you to actually send the email through the platform, which provides you more data and analytics on the back end, like which reporters opened the email, which can be really valuable to know if you're going to follow up with them. So yeah, I mean, I think they're good and I think they're worthwhile, and I have clients that use them and I've used them, and yeah, I have a positive opinion of them. You know, as long as it can be a waste of money if your universe is really small and you can do the research on your own without wasting too much capacity. Okay.
The controversy question.
Oh.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Is it ever wise to decline an interview if you feel they may be offering it to instigate a controversy? Yes, it may be wise. You know, it's not part of the training I give, but there are ways to decline media interviews. Having your name show up or your organization's name show up as unreachable or didn't provide comment is better than screwing something up. So yeah, I think assessing the pros and cons of doing an interview, and I think for a lot of organizations and companies, there are, you know, political and financial considerations and competitive considerations that should go into that. And if you think that it may be more trouble than it's worth or create a bigger problem than the benefit, yes, in my opinion, it is worth declining the interview.
I want to agree with the commenter about using public universities and journalism schools as a resource if you have limited means to get students or interns to help facilitate your communications needs. That's a really good idea. And usually they are very eager and also want to be able to share whatever the newest tools are social wise to be able to reach your audience.
All right. Thanks, Katie. Give everyone another minute. If you got any questions, cool, we'll get to them. If not, also cool. Let's see. Scrolling back through to make sure that I didn't miss anyone. And if you did, if you type something and I'm missing, you type it again because I'm not seeing it. But I'll scroll up.
I do want to touch upon the controversy point. Some of the topics in some circles that we've touched upon today are controversial in regards to kind of moving the needle in a certain direction, and depending upon where you are as a labor leader, as an energy leader, they just are inherently controversial. So I think in some ways you should decline certain interviews, especially if you know that the outlet or the reporter may skew towards sensationalism. But in other ways, it does offer an opportunity if you can remove the emotion from the equation to still stay on your message and keep your talking points clear. They might not even be included in the piece if they're looking to stoke controversy, but they may, and the reader may then be like, hey, I really liked what that person said. And it's not always the case, but it is still media coverage. So that is my one minor counter to if you feel like it's controversial, it may still be okay to get your point across and share with that reporter.
Thanks, Katie. All right. I think they've had enough of us. No more questions.
Oh, there's one more.
Oh,
What does it take for a national outlet to pick up a more state and local story?
That's a great question. Happy to take a stab at this. So yeah, it's something everyone wants to have happen, right? Relating it to a reporter's beat as an example of something that's happening they should be interested in. And here's what I mean by that. And I'll give the ports example as a perfect one. You know, these hydrogen hubs are incredibly important to the current administration. There were reporters writing on them. And as this project advances, I could see a situation where a national reporter could be incredibly interested as an example of one of those taking shape, particularly because it fits within sort of the national interest from a media perspective because of what the administration have said they wanted, which is like a project that is involving organized labor and industry and education, and there's a lot of groups that have come together. So I think showing how your issue project is unique, but part of a national narrative and national story. And just a technique for doing this that I've used in the past, regardless of your issue, is find the national reporters that are on the beat of your issue. If you're a manufacturing company, who are the Wall Street Journal's manufacturing reporters? So on and so forth. And so, you know, that universe of people is not enormous. And try to intro them with an email about what you're doing and why it's a national story. Like, okay, this is happening here and it is of national relevance because. And so, you know, that's not a super detailed answer. You know, that's something that if there was like a really specific example, I could give guidance on, but it's doable. It's hard. But if you can ride the wave of a national news story, that's the easiest way to do it. All right, one more question. Suggestions on scrapbooking media hits. How do you do this for your clients so they can be reused and highlighted? I'm happy to dive into that too. And Katie, hop in on any of this. I'm just kind of spitballing. Yeah, so I think that keeping a list, a running list of every media hit you've gotten is important so that you can include it in a lot of different ways. Bottom of a press release, learn more about our company. It's a lot more valuable if there's a link to a news story that you think really positively like explains something about your organization or company than back to your website. So using it as third-party validation in a press release or when you're making a pitch to a reporter to be like, hey, cover this. If you want to learn a little more, X, Y, and Z outlet already covered us, can be useful. And how you do it, you know, how I do it is I believe in Google Docs because I've paid for similar things and they're not nearly as good. And I just keep a document with a running list of outlet, headline, link to the clip, date, and sometimes pull quotes that you want to make sure are top of mind if you're ever looking back to reference it, because there was like a great paragraph or a great quote within the story. And then if you ever need to refer back to those, you're easily able to do that for any purpose, like a press release or otherwise that I just mentioned.
You know, all of this does fit into the broader category of messaging and communications. And, you know, Demeta's point about cultivating relationships on social media in the chat with journalists via Twitter, it is really important to use whatever resources you have at your disposal, and you can apply the lessons and tips from this webinar to your social media strategy, even though it's slightly different, but the content and messaging would be the same. So I would say, you know, you have a lot of tools to utilize, and the points that's shared here can be modified to fit the different avenues and channels. But I'm glad to hear that's working for you, Meta.
Got another one. Thoughts on formal media training for organizations? If so, where should folks look? Amplifire firm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that it can be really valuable. I think having a leadership that is prepared to speak to the media can prevent problems and open opportunities. You know, I don't think all of them do it. I think everyone should. That's my opinion. And where to look? Yeah, firms. I think my best advice is talk to people you trust who've used firms before and ask their experience of people they've worked with. Because, you know, there could be someone who's very talented at doing it, but their training style or their expertise or their issue areas may not align with yours. So I would lean on the folks that you know at other organizations or other companies who may have enlisted someone in the past to provide a training, and just resource it that way. And yeah, happy to help anyone. I mean, everyone has my email address. And you know, frankly, if you're in another state right now, I know communications people in many states across the country, so I'm happy to provide recommendations for consultants if anyone's interested. You've got my email address.
Yeah, I would agree, and also utilize ASBN as a resource, and me as well. As a producer, I'm accustomed to interviewing people and knowing what that's like, and that doesn't always serve me well being interviewed because I'm constantly self-editing myself. So a good media trainer will help you to be yourself, which is what the person that's talking to you wants you to show up as yourself. But also, you know, follow your script, but don't make it look like a script. Be alive in the moment and let the conversation be organic. But yeah, use ASBN as a source. Obviously, Daniel, we both know a lot of people in different parts of the country, and I personally would be happy to help.
All right. I was saying if any questions come in while I wrap up, we'll answer them, but I'll just close by saying thanks to Katie for joining on this, and really thank you to the sponsors and hosts and partners that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. I enjoyed it, and you all have my email address. So if anyone would like to follow up with me, please feel free to do so. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel. It was an honor and pleasure to be on this panel with you.
Sounds good. All right. So long, everyone.